Hey Flock, Mike here from Epic Duck Studios, and welcome to the Epic Hobby. Today I'm going to be painting up Captain America from Marvel Crisis Protocol by Atomic Mass Games. This video is dedicated to one of my patrons, StarCon85. Thank you so much for your support. If you're interested in supporting the show yourself, you can do so at patreon.com/epicduck. Crisis Protocol comes with large full-color cards, and I'll be using this as a reference as I work. Since I'm painting this in comic style, I'll definitely be using a black ink. For this model, I've chosen Dale Around EFW. For the blue tones in Cap's armor, I'll be using Calidor Sky and Teclis Blue from Citadel, and touching it up with a little bit of P3 Mora White. I'll be using Fenrisian Gray with some Mora White for the white elements of his armor, Mephiston Red and Evil Sun Scarlet for the red elements, Mournfang Brown for the brown elements, and Mechanica Standard Gray and Administratum Gray for the silver parts. Ignore the Celestra Gray, I grabbed that one by accident. For Cap's skin tones, I'll be using Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh, and finally finishing off with some Mora White. I'm going to begin by just base coating all of the red areas. That's going to include the boots, gloves, some areas in his midriff, and some parts of the shield. Now I should be painting the soles of Cap's boots in a darker color. I'm actually going to use Mechanica Standard Gray, but I hadn't really noticed at the time that it was a really distinct detail on the left boot, so I went ahead and painted it all red. On the right boot, you can see I left it alone. Now, Cap's armor has alternating bands of red and white in sort of the belly area or the midriff area. And this is actually probably my least favorite part about this model, simply because the lines that denote the red sections from the white sections aren't really that well defined. They're not very deeply carved into the model, and so it can be a little bit hard to see them. What I actually end up doing as I'm painting these is I'm following the lines I can see. When I get to his back, though, it's actually a little bit indistinct, so what I did was paint the whole area red, hoping the lines would show up a little bit better, and that did actually work out in my favor. So if for whatever reason you can't see the little grooves between the different, alternating stripes, just paint down your red first and get down the white on top of that afterwards, and absolute worst case scenario, just fake it. You can just paint in some alternating stripes, and as long as they're relatively evenly spaced from his left side to his right side, you're going to do okay. So now I'm working on the red aspects of the shield, and of course the shield has the same sort of alternating color pattern, where it's going to be red, white, red, and then blue, with a white star on top. So I'm working on just sort of the outermost circle, and then stepping in 2 circles from that to make it red as well. At this point, it's okay to make some mistakes. This is obviously the very first base coat going down, so there's lots of time yet to make corrections. If you have a little bit of difficulty following these round lines on the shield, don't stress about it too much. You've got lots of time to come in with some, white base coats, or the blue if you're getting more towards the middle, and touch it up. Also, if you're planning to paint this model in comic style, then you're going to have a nice healthy black line between each of the sections, and that'll cover up really small blemishes. So next up, I'm using Calidor Sky as the base coat for the blue aspects of Captain's armor. Now this is a very vibrant blue, and this is something I really like to focus on in comic style, is that I want to make sure my colors are very, very bright, because I'm going to be adding in a lot of black lining later, which does visually bring down the tone of the entire paint job. So by starting from a brighter than normal point, the whole piece kind of reads more traditionally as a whole when it's done. If you're planning to paint Captain America here in a non-comic style, I would probably use a darker base coat such as Cantor Blue, and then use the Calidor Sky as one of the first highlights. Now this step takes a fair bit longer than the red base coats did, because the blue covers a lot more well-defined sections. The red really is just the extremities, right? It's the boots, the gloves, and a little bit of brushwork towards the middle, but even the shield is pretty straightforward, large, easy sections without a lot of complications to them. Whereas here with the blue, we're working around leather straps, working around a star. We're doing a lot more avoidance with the brushwork here, and that does tend to slow it down a fair bit. It also is just a larger area in general than the red is. So when you're working on Cap's cowl, don't forget that there's a tiny little bit of chin guard that is attached by some leather straps. Ideally you'll want to paint those straps in brown as opposed to blue, but you can go full blue if you want to, give it a little bit more of a classic look. There's also the small wings on the side of his head and the A dead center of his forehead. Those are traditionally painted in white, but with the Crisis Protocol box art, the little wings are shown in blue, even though they're actually shown white in all of the character portraits inside of the book. I think basically what I'm trying to say is make the model your own and paint it the way you like. On the shield, the only part that needs to be painted blue is the area of that innermost circle beside the star, so it does take a little bit of finesse to make sure you don't paint the star blue. Finally, I'm also going to be painting the inside areas of the Avengers logo on his left shoulder. Now Citadel's Mournfang Brown is going to basically form the base coat for all of the different belts that Captain America is wearing. He's got a belt around his waist, one around, both shoulders, and those kind of form up into a Y shape on his back. So there's a lot of different, belts going on here for whatever reason. There's also the two straps on the underside of the shield. How much attention you give them is really up to you. If you're painting them in comic style, they're going to end up almost entirely black anyway, but it's kind of worth throwing down the base coat in case you don't end up blacking them out completely and you just don't know what to leave behind. There's a few small straps that form part of his cowl as well. Basically they hold the chin guard in place, but one comes down right in front of the ear, then the other one moves from that across his chin line to the little chin guard, so you want to make sure you hit those in the same color as well, if you didn't already paint them blue. And here's those straps under the shield I was talking about. Next up, I'm going to use Mechanicus Standard Gray as the base coat color for the buckles and other bits of hardware on his belt, as well as the underside of the shield. Now later on I actually end up blacking out the whole underside of the shield, so it's kind of irrelevant, but I didn't know at the time that's what I was going to be doing. Here I'm getting a base coat of Cadian flesh tone down on the ears and exposed part of Cap's face. So next up, I'm using Fenrisian Gray as the base coat for all the white details. So that's obviously the star on his chest, the star on his shield, the one bare stripe in the middle of his shield, the Avengers logo on his shoulder, the A on his forehead, and the two little wings on the side of his cowl. Now this also includes the little white stripes across his abdomen, the ones that alternate with the red stripes, and like I mentioned earlier, they're a little bit harder to pick out than some of the other details on the model, so you do kind of just have to use a little bit of, your own judgment when you're getting to those. Here I'm just using a little bit of Mephiston Red to touch up where the white spilled onto the red ring in the middle of the shield. So now I'm working on Cap's eyes, and I took a very minimalist approach because they're honestly quite small and they're also recessed inside of his cowl. So what I did is I basically painted on the upper eyelid by just getting a little bit of skin tone on the bottom side of that sort of brow overhang, and then taking a little bit of Cantor Blue, which is a really dark blue, painted a line beneath that, which sort of encompasses you know, the pupil, the iris, and just the general fact that the eye is very deeply shaded. After doing that, I'm coming back in with a little bit of the Cantor Sky, the original light blue, and just touching up the shape around the cowl because a little bit of the flesh tone kind of got up on the, you know, the exposed front of the brow ridge, and I didn't really want it there. So I just used this to frame the eye back in. Alright, now I'm back to the Fenrisian Grey and working on those alternating stripes across his abdomen. Now I actually mentioned this much earlier, but now I'm coming with Mechanicus Standard Grey and getting a base coat on the soles of the boots. At this point, Cap is fully base coated and I'm going to be working on highlights now. I'm starting with Evil Sun Scarlet, which is the highlight color I've chosen for the red, and I'm going to begin by working on the shield because it's one of the most interesting aspects of this model. So what I'm doing here on the shield is I'm taking the highlight color, in this case Evil Sun Scarlet, and I'm basically painting pie-sliced shaped sections that are brighter than the base coat, and just sort of random widths and sort of randomly placed around the shield. I'm not trying to make it too patterned or too repetitive. So, you know, some of them are a little bit thinner than others, some of them might double up really quickly, you know, have another line right beside them, and there'll be larger and smaller gaps between each section. But the idea is that they kind of start at a focal point in the middle of the star and then work their way outward towards the very edge of the shield and sort of, you know, grow wider as they approach that edge. And I'm just continuing all the way around the shield, just adding these slices of pie in Evil Sun Scarlet to the red sections. Later I'll revisit the blue and white sections and add matching highlights as well. Believe it or not, I actually based this pattern off of a Captain America foil helium balloon. And now it's time to highlight all the red parts that aren't his shield. I'm going to start with his abdomen, just picking out basically the top of his abs here in the center. I'll then repeat that same highlight for a few points on his back, and then start working on the boots and gloves. Now with his right foot here, he's in a very forward stance. I'm actually only highlighting the back of the boot and then the toe, and then more or less the opposite on the left boot, where it's a little more forward facing, so I'm really going to focus more on the front of the boot. Now Cap's left glove is pretty straightforward because it's basically held out in front of him, big and flat and easy to tell where the top is. So I'm just working the highlights all around there. You know, starting from, you know, the cuff where it meets the sleeve, and then there's this large sort of armor panel on top. There's a little bit of padding on the back of the hand, and then I'm going to pick out the fingers and thumb. The other glove is entirely underneath the shield and doesn't need any highlighting. Now I'll be highlighting the blue parts of the costume with Techless Blue. Now starting with Cap's left leg, that's going to be the top of the knee pad, the top of the thigh, and a little bit of work around the calf where there's some really distinct wrinkles in this clothing. Techless Blue isn't a whole lot brighter than Calidor Sky. I mean, it certainly is a highlight color, but it's not a huge leap forward, and so you can add a little more highlight here than you would with the Evil Sun Scarlet over the Mephiston Red, for example. Of course, it's very important to remember to add some highlights to America's ass. And here I'm just working some highlights into some wrinkles around the top of the boots. Now, because of the cut of Cap's armor, the chest armor is sort of this large, flat, planar area. It's got very minimal curve to it, and so I'm highlighting almost all of it together. I'm going to continue working around the armor, just adding highlights to all the upward facing areas. That's the top of the sleeve, pretty much the entire shoulder on both sides, and the exposed area between the two belts there on his shoulders that's, right behind the neck. Now the cowl is a little bit tricky to highlight simply because it's basically a large upward facing sphere, but you want to draw the highlight towards the front of it to create more sort of a focal point on the face. I want to highlight the nose, the brow ridges, and of course his little bit of chin armor, and so that kind of brings the highlight forward even though it really has kind of otherwise been painted from the top. And that's also part of why I painted such a large highlight across his chest. It just kind of helps justify that light kind of coming in at that sort of 45-ish degree angle. Here I'm quickly coming back in with a little bit of the Calidor sky and just touching up the base coat around the star here on the shield, because I found that it was a little bit flat. The paint had just been a little more translucent than it should have been. Now I'm going to mix a little bit of P3 Moro white into the Teclis blue and make a very light white, and I'm going to use that to pair up with the Evil Sunz Scarlet highlights on the red part of the shield, so that I've got a nice, really light, vibrant blue kind of forming the beginning of each of those little pie slices. Now I'm taking that white-blue mix and I'm using it to just add another layer of highlights to the most important parts of the blue armor. So that's going to be really accenting those facial details, bringing out those brow ridges, the collarbone, and a few other aspects. I'm also adding that same highlight to a few of the more pronounced wrinkles in his clothing to just make them look a little bit deeper. And I'm using that same mix to just brighten up the shoulders a little bit. And here I start working it into the cowl. Because the cowl is such a large, kind of open area, it was a little bit too big of a transition. So I worked a little bit of Teclis blue back in just to feather it out. Just kind of brought that in around the edges of that bright spot I created. Now I'm switching over to pure white here. That's the P3 Moro white. I'm using this as a highlight color for all the white aspects of the costume. So again, that's going to be the star on the shield, the white ring on the shield, and a couple other little elements, the Avengers logo, the A on his chest, etc. Here I use the white with a little bit of the Mechanicus Center Gray mixed in just to rough in shiny spots on his belt buckle. And now we're working on the white abdominal stripes. Now I'm adding some highlights to the cowl details, the wings, and the letter A. And now it's time to make that Avengers logo really stand out. So now I'm using the P3 Moro white on the white star in the middle of the shield to bring those pie slices to a central point in the dead center of that star. Now, because everything's so small at this point, those pie slices are so thin, I'm basically just painting straight lines. I'm not really worried about the fact they have a little taper to them. And of course now I'm going to do the same thing on the outer white ring here, and you can see I'm framing in this sort of pie slice, to keep it in line with the Evil Sun Scarlet bits that have been painted on the red, and then just filling in the middle section. The shield is now getting a lot closer to having that really sort of traditional iconic Captain America shine to it. So now I'm doing a second pass, still using P3 Mora White, but I haven't thinned it down quite so much. The last one was a little bit more of a glaze, and this one's a little bit more straight from the pot. You can see it's going on in just a fairly bright line by comparison. I'm going to be using that just to, make the shield even shinier. So you can see I'm not using this on every single area that I painted previously. Some of the sort of lighter white, or I guess gray sections, I'm leaving alone. So I'm really adding a very bright sort of focal white to different parts of the pie slices now. I'm sort of working details inside of the pie slices. Now I've mixed a little bit of white with the Evil Sun Scarlet, and I'm basically bringing some of the points up in the red areas in line with the new points I created with the white over the white areas. I'm just taking those really, really bright lines I've just made and just extending them through the red parts of the shield. Using that lightened Evil Sun Scarlet, I'm going to add just a few final highlights now to all the other red areas. I'm going to use a little Citadel Steel Legion drab to add some highlights to the belts and pouches, basically anything that got painted brown. I'm throwing a quick base coat of Mechanicus Standard Gray down on the pavement part of the base. That's sort of the big open area around Cap's feet. The other details here are the sidewalk that's kind of behind him, and there's a little sewer grate as well that he's standing on. I'm going to hit that up with more of a rusty color. For the sidewalk here, I mixed Mechanicus Standard Gray and Administratum Gray roughly 50-50 to get just a nice mid-tone gray. I found that the Administratum Gray was just too light on its own. I'm throwing a little bit of the Steel Legion drab, the belt highlight color, down on the sewer grate here to make it look a little bit rusty. And now it's time to start adding all those black lines that make this a comic style miniature. So I'm using Dale Rowney FW ink in black, and to begin with I'm just creating an outline around the model's feet where they make contact with the base. With that done, I start to work my way around the model and just separate things that are adjacent but different colors. So for example, the sole of the boot from the boot from the pant from the belt, etc. I try to do this pretty methodically and start with these lines that break the details down into their sort of separate components, but every once in a while I get kind of carried away with adding a little detail line here and there or working in a little bit of shading, especially when I know the shading is going to make it so I don't have to add some lines to an area. In this case though, I'm being pretty methodical, just working my way around and just, like I say, isolating details from each other. So separating the belt from his torso now, the buckle from the belt, and so on. Now, the alternating red and white stripes along his midriff here, they're not really well defined, so I'm just painting the black line where I've decided they start and end. It may not necessarily be 100% correct, but it gets the job done. Now, as I start to line the straps holding his chin guard in place, I also just add a quick black shadow underneath the chin because I don't really need detail or color there. Here I'm adding some small black lines to either side of Cap's nose and one just between the two eyebrows, basically creating the sort of deeper creases that are part of the cowl. And can't forget to outline that A. So here I'm adding a small shadow underneath the nose by just literally hitting the underside with a little bit of black, and this just helps make that facial detail really readable at tabletop distances. So now as I'm working on the star on Cap's chest, I'm going to begin by outlining it, but I'm also going to bring the black in to the sort of the deep creases between the points of the star and use it to create the impression of some shadows on the undersides of a couple of these points. Similarly, I'm using the black to outline his collarbone and add some deeper shadows underneath his neck, specifically kind of around the Adam's apple. So now black lining on the shield here is one of the trickiest parts to do well, simply because the lines have to basically form perfect circles, except of course the star where I'm starting here. What I'm doing is just working my way around the star, and you can see I'm being pretty slow and methodical, making sure my lines are nice and straight, and also the same thickness all the way around. I'm just, painting these little sort of pie slices, right? I'm doing the two adjacent sides of the star, and then the little, fifth circle between them, and just working my way around that center area that way. So with the blue area and the star completely outlined, I'm now working on the transitions between the red and white areas. So there's two of these, and you can see, again, I'm being very slow and methodical, and I'm only doing small sections at a time. I'm not trying to actually paint an entire circle in one go, but I'm just doing short, small strokes, and then rotating the model a little bit and doing the next stroke. You can see I'm almost always pulling the stroke more or less straight up and down, mostly from the bottom of the model upwards. And that's because I find that's where I have the most control. That is the single stroke that I can perform most consistently. And so that's the one I want to use when I'm doing any kind of fine detail like this, is orient the model to make use of what my most consistent brushstroke is. And once you find your most consistent brushstroke, you can get a lot of mileage out of it. Now, as I've been working on the model, I've come to realize that the underside of the shield is effectively never seen. So here I'm just blacking out the edge a little bit to create a nice profile black line. And then the entire underside of the shield, I'm just going to swathe with black ink. I just want to hide it. Now I'm taking the black ink and I'm actually working some dark lines into the red sections of the shield. I'm purposely skipping over the blue and the white or silver areas and just incorporating these into the red, so it makes the reds just look a little bit deeper. What this is just sort of very thin lines, again sort of just at random cardinal points like all the highlights were in these sort of not quite so pie shaped. In this case they're more like straight lines. I want them to be very thin and be very, very low impact because they're just so dark. I don't want them to be a wide slice of the shield. I want them to just be very thin little accents, and you can see they're almost every 60 degrees, but then I'm sort of just randomizing it a little bit because I want roughly 6 or 7 around the radius of the shield, but I don't want them to just look like they're evenly spaced. Alright, my narration was off a little bit. Here is where I black out the bottom of the shield. Now that I'm starting to work on the legs, I want to add some deeper shadows because there's always areas on the legs of models that are very, very obfuscated, especially between the legs and sort of the underside of each thigh. These also help create sort of lines that are viewed in profile, so when the model is viewed from specific angles, you see a stark line outlining the leg, and it also just helps when, again, when the model is viewed in profile, one leg stands off against the other a lot more readily when there's at least some black on the leg in the back. And so that's how I pick my angles for these. I like it so that, you know, the underside of the leg, first of all, is always painted black because that's the part you're going to see least from the tabletop. But also so that when the leg is viewed when the two legs sort of visually overlap, it helps create a distinct boundary between them. Now, often when I'm painting models in comic style, I use a technique called hatching, which is painting basically diagonal lines that taper away from a black area into a colored area. And this creates the illusion of a fade, because it's darkest in the black and lightest on the opposite side, and the tapers produce a visual transition. Because there are so many wrinkles in Captain America's legs, especially around the boots, it's not necessary to actually add a hatch mark everywhere, so what I recommend here is paint in the underside of each wrinkle first, and then add the hatching where it's needed. So you can see I add a lot of it to sort of the inside of the thigh. There's a little bit of like an armor pad there, and I make sure that gets picked out with a little bit of the diagonal line transitions. But around the top of the calf, I don't really add any because there's just so many wrinkles already happening there. It kind of takes care of itself. This is actually the perfect angle to see what I call that profile outline. The entire inside edge of Cap's left leg basically has a black outline drawn in place from this angle. So now I'm basically repeating the process I did with the legs on the arms, but because of the pose of this model, it's not really that striking. Both arms are held more or less horizontally, and so that means there's not really an angle you can view the model at from the tabletop where you're going to see that black outline. So it's really just there more for like photography and for my own peace of mind, but it ultimately isn't going to actually impact the presentation of the model all that much as a gaming piece. What the large areas of black let you do, though, is just ignore lining areas. I know I don't have to come in here and paint the individual lines between his fingers because it's on the bottom side of the model, and the bottom side of the model I almost always present as black because it just doesn't contain necessary information, especially as a gaming piece. You don't see the bottom of models on a table unless you've knocked them over, and you shouldn't be doing that. At this stage now, looking at the model in profile, I'm using that underlining on the arm to just develop some shadows. So I'm pulling some hatch marks, just some small tapering lines into that shadowed area. Just very small ones, sort of to create just the feeling of the arm having, more of a kind of cylindrical volume to it. Now I'm using a series of small sort of tapered horizontal lines to just kind of drop that shadow from the arm down onto the side of the torso. So at this point, Cap is done, and I'm just working on his base now. So I'm going to be adding some comic style lining to all the different details in the base here, and then a little bit of freehand detail. Unfortunately, the shot of me filling in the little, the grill on that little sewer vent he's standing on, the shot was completely fuzzy, so I couldn't include it, but you can tell what I did there. I just filled it in with some black, the same as I'm doing with these cracks right now. So my approach to doing a pre-textured base like this in comic style isn't a lot different than the model itself. I'm picking out all of the sculpted detail that I can. In this case, I'm following cracks and, lines in the pavement, but it's not really any different than following panel lines on the armor or something similar. I'm going to go a little bit further though and start adding some freehand surface details in a moment. You'll see what I'm talking about when I get there. Now before I do that, I'm just going to quickly black the entire sort of stepped edge of this base. This base has like an upper lip and a lower lip, and I'm just grabbing that sort of profiled little edge and just doing that in black right now. The actual outer rim of the base I'm going to be painting in a lighter color just to signify what team the model belongs to, even though teams are a very loose concept in Crisis Protocol. Alright, so now I'm working in some freehand detail, and this is just basically small surface blemishes, and they don't really represent anything. They're, little freestanding stones, they're chips, they're dents, they're whatever you want them to be. They don't really, they're not big enough to be significant. They just add surface texture and break up the large open areas. Some of them are little squiggly lines, some of them are dots. Mostly I try and draw little boxes or little circles, and usually I draw them in groups of 2 or 3. And I just kind of work my way around the surface doing that. Now I'm also back on Cap again. I forgot to do this. I'm just inking in the little areas around the Avenger logo on his shoulder. And we're back to the base again. Alright, now I'm going to add that splash of color to the rim of the base. In this case I'm using Reaper Templar Blue. It's just a color I happen to really like, and it's not really present in any of the miniatures I'm painting, and that's one of the reasons I chose it. I wanted to sort of not necessarily tie back to a specific miniature. Just felt like a good decision to me at the time. It's just the rim of the base, and you can do whatever you want with it. To make sure I've got, a really nice flat color here on the base rim, I'm getting 2 or 3 coats of this Templar Blue down. And that finally wraps up Captain America. He's ready to hit the table, and I just need a few more Avengers to go with him. Hey, thanks for watching my video. If you enjoyed that one, please hit like and subscribe, and don't forget to hit the bell icon so you get notifications when I post new content in the future. If you want to take your support even further, you can do so at patreon.com/epicduck. Every little bit helps me keep the lights on and the paint flowing, puts new models on the table so I can make interesting videos, and most importantly, keeps a roof over my family's head and food on the table. Honestly, Patreon is what makes doing this every single day possible. You can also catch me 6 times a week at twitch.tv/epicduckstudios. I'd really love it if you came by to watch my show sometime and clicked follow. A big thank you to everyone who has supported my stuff, both past and present, over the years. It's been a wild ride, and I couldn't do this without the fans and all of the wonderful flockers out there. The hobby community is just an amazing group of people, and you make this worth doing. So let's keep doing this together for years to come. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, do something epic.